Hi, this is Greg Kesich at the Portland Press Herald, and I'm here with our Sunday columnist, Alan Caron, and Molly Adams.
Hey.
How do we introduce you, Molly?
I'm the marketing coordinator.
The marketing coordinator and all-around know-it-all.
Wicked smart.
Somebody wicked smart, somebody who can explain things to us.
We couldn't function without her.
Yeah, she makes the microphones go.
Can I just ask a question that I think I'd put back in the beginning to you, having lived through more waves of social change in America than I have? Did you find...
I'm younger, so all I've seen is decline. All my waves have been the tide going out.
Were you shocked by what happened in Charlottesville this weekend? Because that was a refrain, a back and forth refrain that I saw on my social media of white people of all different ages doing the I'm shocked, I'm saddened, this isn't America. And then white people and people of color, kind of responding with, what do you mean you're shocked? This is America, this is American history. Did you feel like this was something that went away? Do you feel this is something that's always been present?
I heard a really interesting statement by Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts, and this was actually recorded before last weekend's events. And he said, one of the things that makes our democracy work are sort of rules of engagement. It wasn't his term, but basically decorum, politeness, an understanding that certain things are off limit, and that the characteristic of the Trump era is, and we'll just call it the Trump era because it's not just him, but that things that used to be embarrassing to say in public are now very applauded. So I guess what I was very saddened by was to see what looked like an internet phenomena, something that took place on the message boards, actually play out in real life. There actually were crowds of Nazis in the streets of an American city, waving the American flag and the Nazi flag at the same time, and they were they were met with counter protest. But so I guess that's where I would say I was surprised. This is yet another step in this devolution about moving into an area where everything that's provocative and extreme and transgressive is rewarded.
Yeah, and to me, the neo-Nazi movement, if we could call it that more broadly, includes the KKK and all of these real fringe elements. They've always been pretty small. They tapped into a much wider apprehension about change and others and people that don't look like me, but they were pretty small. Trump's election has enabled them, encouraged them to think bigger, to go bigger. And this event in Charlottesville, to me, was an example of how they're stepping up. They're going much more open. And I think this event, what transpired with this guy driving the car through the crowd, is a huge setback for them. It's a huge setback. And even, I suspect, within their own ranks, people who are part of that rally are feeling like, holy moly, where's this going? So I think this could be a pivotal moment in sort of pushing them back into the dark spaces where they are the mushrooms rapidly growing, but nobody sees them.
It's not good, though. It's not a good development.
It's a bad problem for them because now this defines the neo-Nazi alt-right movement in America.
You've given Nazism a bad name. Yeah, no, it's not a good cultural. It's not a good development for America, I think.
I heard something this morning from an analyst on terrorism. And, now saying there's more right-wing terrorism in America, more people killed by right-wing terrorism than by Islamic terrorism.
Yeah, Timothy McVeigh.
Right. Yeah, right. So, this is part of the conversation. And I'm an incurable optimist. And And so I believe that these events get people talking about things they have not been talking about. Maybe they don't want to, maybe they don't understand, but it gets people talking around the kitchen table and asking whether this is going too far. And
Well, what do you think, Molly? Were you surprised?
No, I wasn't surprised. I personally have always had an interest in hate crimes and the trends of hate crimes and the growth and reduction of militias and sovereign citizens in the U.S. And it really didn't surprise me at all. What was upsettingly satisfying from this weekend is that I had gotten into a Facebook fight months ago with a Trump voting friend that, you find out it's about a lot more than Trump for him. And he's a young white man who I felt was like going into this racist territory, and constantly, his refrain is sort of like, it's a thought experiment. It's just ideas. We're just talking when we talk about a white ethno-state. I was like, yes, but if you put, my argument with him was like, but yeah, if you put those ideas into motion, though, it means death and destruction. And, moving away from racism, understanding the many, many things that come into play to create systemic racism takes like a lot of years of thinking and talking and working. And what was upsetting to me that it happened, but like somewhat satisfying, was that this rally did end in extreme violence. It ended in deaths. And for a lot of young people, like you said, it came off the message boards and went into real life, and people died, people lost their jobs, people got, permanent facial injuries from the last weekend. And it made a reality of these quote unquote ideas that people are just talking about all the time. So I'm not surprised. I'm a little scared is sort of how I feel. I feel like people are still really emboldened. I don't think this weekend alone is going to quell more demonstrations like this.
I was at the Monument Square rally last night in response to Charlottesville, and a couple of speakers said something along the lines of, we have to tolerate everybody who's different than us, and we have to listen to them, but we can't create any space for these crazy ideas to take root. And I'm thinking, okay, what kind of editorial page policy could I have that would facilitate those conflicting goals? Like, either you listen to them and you still disagree with them, or you shut them down because they're outside the bounds of the discussion we'll have. And I think there's what I saw with these guys, the far right, the alt-right, white supremacist, white nationalists, whatever they call themselves, there's like a currency in victimhood that you get some moral authority from being a victim and being criticized or kicked out of a cab. Can you imagine not being humiliated by that experience, that like you were kicked out of a cab because you were racist, and you go tell the world on Twitter?
You want to advertise the fact
you want to advertise, but it's
yeah.
because online everybody wants to be the victim, and that's where you get your rage from. Your righteousness comes from the fact that other people are trying to put you down and not listen to you. And,
You're right that now the victimhood of being an angry young white man is that people don't want to listen to you.
Right.
That's how you're able to capitalize on victimhood. Yeah, which is just really tough to me, because I don't understand why you would want to be a victim or why you would want to be oppressed. And that's what I think both, however you identify politically, and not all white people, but that is something that white people are searching out sometimes when they don't have it. But I also think a lot about, that trope of like, oh, it wasn't the racism that got Donald Trump elected, it was the economic anxiety, which I really do believe on some level, because for very poor white people in this country, like, one, you're really living in a basically 100% white community.
Right.
Most of the very poor, when you're living in Appalachia, rural Maine, and these conversations that are being held about white privilege and cultural appropriation, like, there's such abstract problems that if you are struggling to eat day to day, like, I can see why you would tune out all the racist rhetoric and just want to hear the messages of how Donald Trump's going to save you, how Donald Trump's going to bring you jobs. And so I think you're right, Greg, in that, like, people are really sick of being shamed for something that they really aren't directly responsible for.
And I think what they like about Donald Trump is not so much he's going to bring us jobs as he makes people I don't like really mad. And there's a cultural split. Alan and I are old enough to remember when Republicans were all about economics and they didn't want to engage in social issues. And there was fringe groups within the Republican Party that they would deal with, for instance, like the Right to Life movement started as a kind of an extreme fraction of the Republican Party before it took over, and became the standard for all. It became the standard position for all Republican candidates. And the same is true with these alt-right guys who their claim, their gripe is purely cultural. It's not about manufacturing jobs. It's about we want to return to a kind of country that we think we used to be. And how do you knit that together? Like, how do you? What about the people who just want lower taxes? Where do they fit in that party?
I mean, we're touching a lot of issues here, but I think this race that Trump won, and we've talked about this before, there had to be a lot of different pieces come together to make that happen. One of them was clearly race, and the subsurface racism in the country. It's been here forever. It wasn't always a problem for Republicans. It became a problem when the Republicans adopted the Southern strategy and converted all those Dixiecrat Confederate states into Republican states. They have since been happy to own that vote, but it's always been communicated in code, just below the surface. No. What's happening now is a real outbreak. I mean, folks like us have been talking about this since the election. This is a big problem. You're making racism overt. You're denying it, but you're making it much more welcome. Now this thing blows up, which is why I think this is a real turning point for the country. I think this is one of those learning moments where in a short period of time.
Sandy Hook was supposed to be a turning point for the country.
well, it was, and they all are. But it's not like a switch gets flipped in one instant. You have to see these in a succession of these. I do anyway, in a succession of moments. But what is really at work here now is that the racist movement may not have a home after this. I mean, there are major Republicans all across the country calling essentially for the expulsion of these groups from the Republican Party.
But to me, you're calling for the expulsion of like a voter bloc. What are these Republicans doing and Democrats doing when it comes to like voter registration laws? When it comes to like getting an automatic voter registration going in your state, revising how districts are redrawn. I think there's always a lot of rhetoric around personal feeling, and we need to love each other, we need to love our neighbors.
Yeah, there isn't a lot of that rhetoric on the right, by the way. I mean, you just heard the president say
it.
But you don't hear a lot.
We need to show affection for each other, which always
Hello.
creeps me out when the president says
How's that
something
working?
like that.
Let's talk to Comey about affection. Let's talk to Hillary Clinton about affection. So, I mean, I think that's just...
But okay, so if you were,
well, I was going to say, because that's also like a hypocrisy that I see from the left, to see that the Democrats are trying to figure out how do we court this voting bloc now from donating to and rallying around pro-life candidates I've seen a little more law and order rhetoric from Democratic candidates. I feel like there was a strategy from Hillary Clinton. Rather than engaging people to the left of her, she tried to engage people to the right of her who were not into Donald Trump.
Yeah, she didn't do that very well, by the way.
And she didn't do it very well.
She spent a lot of time, not to revisit all that history, but she spent a lot of time trying to make amends with the Sanders bloc on the left. And she forgot to go to Michigan. Mm-hmm. And she forgot to go to where the working class swing voters were. This is the point of like not lumping all of these folks, the folks motivated by, I want a decent job, I want a decent life, not lumping them together with racists just because they're white.
Yeah.
Right? That group of people, and when you look at the numbers of the votes in those states, the swing votes were Obama voters. Mm-hmm. White working class Obama voters went all the way over because, in my opinion, Hillary Clinton wasn't paying attention to them.
Do you think the Democrats would have success in embracing the far left in the same way the GOP has done in embracing the far right, in finding the liberal equivalent of Ted Cruz? You know, someone who's unapologetically for universal health care, for ending mandatory minimums. Like, do you think that there would be success on, would you have to identify a local level and then a state level? Could there ever be national success for a candidate like, what were
What's
the
his
big
name?
anti-war?
Bernie Sanders?
Yeah, or, the big anti-war candidates in the 60s.
Yeah,
or,
who lost like 49 states.
Yeah, I mean, could there ever be that possibility?
There's an incredible echo chamber in both of these primaries, right? It's hard to see how somebody to the left of, to the far left in Maine could succeed. Now, Bernie Sanders did it in Vermont.
Did he win Maine too? Did he?
He won the main primary.
He won the
caucus
caucuses
by a lot. But you're talking about you got elected statewide.
We're talking about the general election. What I mean by the echo chamber is somebody who's extremely popular in the Democratic activist base. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily true that they're popular once they get out of that thing. So Bernie Sanders is a great example. I thought he ran a terrific campaign, far exceeded any expectations. Yeah. Partly because of the weakness of Hillary Clinton, but he ran a great campaign and he focused on the economic issues and he focused on working class people, and they liked him. They really did. And if it had been possible in a Democratic primary, they would have made him the nominee. So it's like, here's the playbook, Hillary, right? Here's how you jazz people up in this primary. In Maine, we used to have working class candidates, Joe Brennan, perfect example, who energized working class people. And if you actually analyzed where those people, what their position was on all the issues, they weren't all like pro-choice and environmentalists, but it was part of the coalition.
See, right? This is where I want to go back to the hypocrisy of the left, because every time I've kind of had this conversation with registered Democrat friends or family of mine, they're like, yeah, but then if Bernie got the nomination, the anti-Semitism would have been out of control. I'm like, so you're preemptively saying that you wouldn't have wanted Bernie Sanders to be, it wasn't his policies, no. I was worried that the opposition would just focus on his Jewishness and he just would never have won.
Well, I think there's a cultural divide in the Democratic Party too, between sort of the institutionalists and the outsiders. And Bernie, I think, I suspect a lot of Bernie supporters were more excited about him as an outsider than they were as his healthcare plan. The proof I have of that is that when Hillary Clinton adopted almost all of his ideas, including the $15 minimum wage, the people, Bernie supporters didn't come over.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the
same. She voted for the war.
Yeah, it was the
right.
same. Yeah.
I've known I don't like her for a long time. Yeah. I can't really remember why.
Mm-hmm.
I think a populist in the Democratic Party could win and an outsider could win that primary, any of these primaries, going away. I think, and that's what you saw with Bernie Sanders. To a lot of people, Bernie Sanders, I'm talking to working class people like in my family, he wasn't a guy on the left. He was a populist. He was talking about stuff that mattered to them. So they didn't see it as left-right because they hardly understand really all of this left-right stuff. But he was fighting for the little guys. He was fighting for me. And he was talking first and foremost about things that are important to me. And so I think people love them for it. So I think that's an illustration of how what I would call populists could win the Democratic primary. But the problem in the Democratic side is the insiders hold all the levers.
So, Alan, you had a really interesting column this weekend. There's been a lot of speculation that Susan Collins is going to run for governor, and you had a column where you asked her not to. Do you want to expand on that a little?
It seems to me that she's got to stay in the Senate. I mean, the Republican-Democratic balance in the Senate is so close right now, and she's exactly at the pivot point. She has had and will have enormous influence in the shape of policy over the next couple of years. I think there's an emerging bloc of moderate D's and I's that are working together. You're going to see them in September, by the way, launch into how to fix the Affordable Care Act. And she's a leader in that group. And she's been doing this quietly for a long time. She has an opportunity now to really emerge as the leader of that bloc, which will hold, I would argue, more power than Donald Trump will to affect actual policy, actually getting things done. On the other hand, she runs for governor. That's a tough road to take in the Republican primary because they matter to her right now. And LePage has threatened to bring her down, and I have no doubt. I mean, I think this is why Olympia Snowe bailed out, because the Republican primary has gotten so far to the right that nobody who even thinks about being more moderate can survive. Now, she may be the exception. She's enormously popular. I think more popular now overall than she was before. But that is a risky path to take. So I think rather than do that, she's got 4 more years on her Senate term. She may well end up being chair of a major committee in Congress, even perhaps appropriations, whose chairman is now 80. She could have an enormous impact on Maine and the nation. And so please, Susan, if you're listening, stay in the Senate. And secondly, if she's going to run for governor, she ought to think long and hard. I know everybody says she won't do this, but she should think long and hard about following the track that Angus King has taken and running as an independent. So a very interesting response to that, needless to say.
Isn't there also a risk that she takes of if she didn't run for governor, that she has kind of gotten the ire of the president and possibly Mitch McConnell? If Republicans, conservatives, Tea Party type conservatives consolidate their control in the Senate with the next election, she could be really left out. I mean, she's not a chairman of a committee now, even though she's got a lot more seniority than many others. And if she's seen as this kind of party of one, maybe she doesn't get to have that influence.
Yeah, I don't think it's a party of one any longer. And again, I would pay close attention to this healthcare committee work that's coming up in September.
Yeah.
Because I think you're going to see a bipartisan effort to save the ACA, which is to say to ensure that the insurers will be paid and therefore they won't have to raise rates in the way they're now suggesting they will. So I think that's going to further a process that's underway. The other process that's underway is the president attacking Mitch McConnell has aggravated a lot of Republicans in the Senate. And if this president isn't more careful, he's not going to have any friends in the Senate. And in that event, Susan Collins' vote with the Senate majority is going to matter in every issue they take up. So it would not surprise me if, in order to get her vote on some future critical piece of legislation, so they can have one victory to point to, that they don't offer her something. And I'm not saying she'd trade her vote for a committee chair, but things happen. Mm-hmm. And so, however it all plays out, it seems to me she has more influence going forward than less.
Well, she said that was the criteria she was going to use
Right.
to decide how she could help Maine the most. I have a friend who claims that the number one export from Maine is the 4 people we send to Washington and the money they send back. And that it's all based on seniority. He has a very cut and dry opinion. He votes for Democrats. He votes for Republicans. Who's ever been around the longest, so that they, that they can ship money back here. And but you raise a point in terms of national issues. You were saying you'd heard from people from other states. Same thing happened to me when my family was visiting from California. They knew all about Susan Collins, and they were very impressed.
She's gained a national stature, and one of the questions for her is, do you want to be on the Sunday morning talk shows whenever you want, or do you want to come back to Augusta and talk to Mal Leary and live in Augusta? So
that's a tough one, I think.
Which job pays better?
By far the Senate.
Yeah, the Senate.
Oh, by
far.
a lot. Yeah. The governor only pays $70,000 a year.
I mean, if she comes back and wants to run for governor, I think that's good for Maine, and she no doubt could win a general election. I don't think there's any question about that. It's just whether she'll survive the primary. Now, it's worth looking at Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, who lost the Republican primary and then won as a write-in. No doubt Susan Collins is aware of that strategy. There are other strategies.
Is it legal in Maine can you...
that I don't know.
You can't get on the ballot as an independent if you've lost a primary. So you have to pick. But what Lisa Murkowski did was won as a write-in in a 3-way, and not the easiest name to spell.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean...
Yeah. And that's a incredibly tough path to take, no matter how you do it. I mean, there's 100 failures for every one success. I got a great letter from someone yesterday suggesting, we could get a lot of Democrats and independents to register as Republicans in that primary and overwhelm the far right. That's also a very tough strategy. If anybody could do it, probably Collins could do it, because the sympathy and the support for her is very high right now, even among Democrats. But that's an interesting way to win a primary, and then you end up, it looks like Republicans didn't support you, but all these other people did. So, right. But to me, why would you risk all of those? Are all long shot strategies and hardly even tested. So,
except you still have 4 years left on your term, and if you lose, if you go back to Washington. You're still the you're still the senator.
You're senator, but you lose influence in the Washington culture because you lost at home. The people at home didn't support you. I mean, that's a dent in your reputation that you don't need to risk.
So did you hear it all from readers on your piece?
Yeah, I mean, I heard from Republicans who basically wanted to vent on how much they hated Susan Collins because, quote, she's a Democrat dressed up as a Republican. This seems to be the line of attack, and I hear the same things on other issues from the left. I mean, if you don't support the party dogma 100%, then you have to be a member of the other party, as though there's nothing in the middle. There's no variation. There's no gradation. It's just us and them.
Wouldn't it be so much easier if everything were just two sides in this world, is what I thought a lot about this weekend.
What else do we have? Such an interesting times we live in.
We live in interesting times, and I predict that they will still be interesting next week. So I think we'll sign off for today and see what happens.
In the new world headquarters.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the Portland Press Herald podcast. Make sure you never miss a podcast episode by subscribing on iTunes or your favorite podcast aggregator.
please rate and review us if you think we're good. If you don't think we're good, send a link to an enemy. Send questions or comments via email to letterstotheeditor@pressherald.com. Lastly, you can find older episodes, including more interviews with reporters about their coverage of Medicaid, the opioid epidemic, and city politics at pressherald.com/podcast. We'll talk with you next week.